Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Napa Legal Podcast. I'm Margaret Bush, Executive Director of Napa Legal.
And I'm Frank DeVito, Senior Counsel and Director of Content at Napa Legal.
You're listening to the Napa Legal Weekly Podcast, where we explore religious liberty through the lens of faith-based nonprofits. To briefly introduce our organization, Napa Legal's mission is to develop talented leaders for two cornerstone institutions: the nonprofit sector, specifically faith-based nonprofits, and the legal profession. You can learn more about our work on our website. In this inaugural episode, we want to outline the foundational principles of our work and our team's perspective on the importance of religious freedom and the work of nonprofits in particular.
Yeah, I think it's a really helpful starting episode for this podcast. This is going to be very different in scope and angle than our typical weekly podcast will be. I think normally we're going to be covering a lot of the religious liberty legal cases and statutory policy developments at the state level, especially. But this time we're going to go high level and talk about some of the principles, the foundations of our take on religious liberty and on the work of faith-based institutions. I think it's important to really just lay out the groundwork of what it is that we're trying to do. So in particular, I think it helps to approach our work on key law and policy issues by distinguishing means from ends. We're going to talk about that a lot throughout this episode. Religious freedom, as important as it is, it's not an end in itself, right? It's a means to promote the free exercise of religion for the benefit of individuals, so that individuals can worship God and become better, more virtuous people, and for the benefit of society, which improves and benefits when individuals can put their faith into action in their families, in their professions, and in their communities. So again, as important as religious freedom is, it's not the end. The end is individuals and organizations that can practice religion for the good of society.
Yes, that's right. And with religious freedom, as with all the issues we're going to discuss on this podcast, we want to approach the topic from first principles. I think you put it really well, Frank. Navigating the relationship between what St. Augustine calls the city of God and the city of man is, in a principled way, it's the age old challenge and one of the fundamental responsibilities of government in a just society. I mean, we've seen this in works like Antigone as early as ancient Greece, people exploring questions about the scope of authority for civil power and how to navigate and how to choose the right course of action when civil law conflicts with what Antigone describes as the unchanging, immutable laws of God. At times, the government may have a positive duty to act to protect religious freedom, and at other times, the government may have a negative duty to refrain from exercising its power or acting in a way that trespasses into a realm that should rightfully be reserved for religion. In today's world, where people carry out their beliefs so often through faith based nonprofits, I think the balance, particularly between government regulations and government's actions and faith based nonprofits, is crucially important. We want to see faith based nonprofits flourish. And so that's what we're exploring on this podcast.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And seeing these institutions flourish is another good reminder that, again, promoting the work of faith-based nonprofits is not an end in itself, right? Our goal is not to let faith-based nonprofits be free so they can do whatever, right? And like as if the end of their work is outside of the scope of what we care about, right? Successful faith-based nonprofits are a means to the end of accomplishing good religious works in society, right? The good ends are evangelization and education of the people, and the performance of the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, right? So that people are being catechized, but also so that the hungry are being fed and the homeless are being housed, and so on. This is the work of faith-based nonprofits and the reason that it's so important for us to promote their work so that these good ends are accomplished. So as we move forward with this podcast, the specific cases and laws that we will discuss, they're a necessary part of the work of religious organizations because these various developments in law and policy will impact the ability of religious organizations to believe, to speak, and to act in the public square based on their religious faith.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's important to remember at a practical level, these organizations give more than they receive in terms of humanitarian aid and other relief. The corporal works of mercy, like you talked about, Frank, there are numbers of studies that show this. And the flourishing of faith-based organizations and religious freedom correlates with the flourishing of civil rights across the board. And so, while Friends of Religious Freedom will be particularly interested in the issues we're discussing, all friends of freedom should really find these conversations relevant to our shared vision.
Yeah, that's a great point. So as we kind of get into the some of the details of our principles that we'll be working from on this podcast moving forward, I think it's just important again to repeat this distinction about means and ends, because the work of Napa Legal is ultimately to promote religion in the public square and the benefits to society that come when religious freedom is respected and when faith-based nonprofits are free to accomplish their missions. Right, as you said, Mary Margaret, the all friends of freedom should promote these things because ultimately, when religious organizations are free to do the works that their faith promotes them, moves them to do, that's going to be better for everyone, better for individuals, better for citizens, even the ones who are not religious. So the ultimate goal of our work for religious liberty for faith-based nonprofits is good, healthy citizens and good, healthy societies. Religion does have a lot to say about these goods, right? So it's not just, oh, we'll let religious organizations work and their various works will just come together and accomplish um, good for society. But there are very specific things that we're going to be talking about a lot, right? The religious views on a lot of fundamental building blocks of society are important in discussing what makes for a good society and a good life, right? The religious views, particularly a lot of the Christian organizations that we work with, are going to have very specific views on the reality of the human person, what the human person is, and what the human person is for. Right, a healthy culture of marriage and family, the proper expression of sexuality, and so on. These are core issues for what it means to be good and to have a good life and a good society. And religious views have a lot to say about the proper interpretation of the person and marriage and family and sexuality. And I think it's worth saying that Napa Legal's mission is very multi-denominational and interreligious, right? We serve and work with organizations that are Catholic, Protestant, and of other non-Christian faiths as well. But that being said, we're an explicitly Catholic organization. And so when we're talking about the principles that undergird our understanding of religious freedom and of faith in the public square, we speak from an authentically Catholic viewpoint, even as we do promote a diversity of religious exercise in the public square.
Yes, it's a great point that these questions of human anthropology that are kind of at the intersection of social or public policy issues and issues of religion, they're challenging and controversial and as we've seen at times very polarizing issues. So given that sensitivity, we always want to approach the conversation with a deep compassion, a respect for the human person, and the sense that the image of God in which each of us is created is should always stay at the forefront of the conversation. But at the same time, in the spirit of respect and true charity, the truth always needs to matter because the truth is our only path towards human flourishing. So, with that in mind, on the podcast, we'll always be honest about the truth and what our faith has to say on these issues. We don't want to shy away from the answers to these big questions. The questions matter, we know that. But what we have to remember is the answers matter too. These are not just thought exercises or hypotheticals. So when our Catholic faith gives answers or gives principles to these big questions, we'll share those and we'll explore that on this podcast. I've learned a lot from Professor Helen Alvarez on these topics. She writes compellingly about the richness of the Catholic vision of the human person, and from a legal perspective, that for this rich vision to even be present in society, faith-based institutions need to have a space to exist. The law cannot be attacking them. The law, in fact, needs to be preserving these institutions' right to be who they are. So, to give us like a specific example, a Catholic school needs to be able to hire a team, build an organization, and give witness in accord with certain truth claims about the human person in order to be authentically Catholic and also to give society an opportunity to see what does this vision of the human person look like? How do we give society a chance to see, okay, here's what it looks like when this biblical worldview is lived out. And without the requisite legal protections, these truth claims can't even be explored. We can't even be asking kind of what is the Catholic perspective on what it means to be human? What role does biological sex have to play in the common good, or and what should it play in public policy? So while we think religious liberty in general is very important, we're looking particularly at this with respect to nonprofits as institutions, and we see this as a crucial part of efforts to promote the flourishing of society as a whole today.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the Catholic school question will help to highlight some of the distinctions and issues that we're going to get into in the second half of this discussion here, right? Because Part of what we're going to try to lay out here is that a lot of the legal issues and policy issues that we pay attention to at Napa Legal and on this podcast going forward, they don't look like straight religious freedom issues, right? Not every one of them is going to be a battle over a Religious Freedom Restoration Act being passed in a state, or free exercise, First Amendment claim at the Supreme Court. A lot of them are going to be on state law issues, state law exemptions, various things that maybe at first blush don't look like straight religious freedom issues. But as Mary Margaret said, if these ancillary laws aren't built to allow faith-based organizations to be who they are, then they become religious freedom issues, right? Like if a state doesn't have good exemptions or exclusions for faith-based nonprofits in hiring or in public accommodations, then right, the Catholic school is not able to hire a team united around the faith to choose their students and the people who are involved in the organization based on their shared vision about the human person and about the world. And so at that point, it is a religious exercise issue, because if these laws don't give these organizations the room they need to be who they are, then they're not doing their mission. They're not accomplishing their mission. They're not able to form with a coherent Catholic identity in this case. So there are a lot of issues that are going to be brought into the fold in these discussions that as religious freedom issues. So it's good to start with this high level discussion, and this will, I think, help tie together the work we do and the issues that we care about. So particularly, there'll be a lot, right? Sometimes what we're talking about is non-discrimination law type issues at the state level. Sometimes it's like tax and regulation issues. So it's going to be a broad range of legal issues that we'll be discussing. I think some of the highlights are that maybe are the most hot button, the ones that draw the most attention in the news, in the headlines. Um, Transgender issues, abortion issues, marriage issues. So it's a good question. Why are these issues, transgender, abortion, marriage, why are
Mhm.
these relevant to the work of Napa Legal? If what we're doing is trying to support religious freedom and the work of faith-based nonprofits, are these legitimately part of that scope? And the answer is yes. And that's what we want to talk about now. I think for at least two reasons. First, even if some of these issues don't look like straight religious liberty issues directly, these issues have serious consequences for the good of society, right? If law and policy are used to promote ways of living that conflict with a religious understanding of the human person and of human sexuality, we would argue this is bad for society, right? A society that promotes harmful medical interventions that deny the God-given sex of a human person, laws or policies that endorse a false view of marriage that undermines the self-gift of spouses open to creating new life, or law and policy that encourages, a concept of women's rights that allows somebody to legally kill an unborn child that's made in the image and likeness of God. These are policies that lead to a bad society. Religious freedom and the role of faith-based nonprofits is to promote all aspects of religious belief, morality, and practice in the public square. So this does mean combating bad ideas that are contrary to the religious view of the human person, marriage, sexuality, because those bad ideas are ultimately harmful to the common good.
Yes, I think it's funny too because there's a clear kind of discomfort, particularly in the mainstream media, about discussing areas where, what is being branded as a social or public policy issue is intersecting with the religious freedom issue. And it's in other contexts as a society, we're very comfortable just looking for the truth. I think, for example, there are a lot of conversations about excessive sugar consumption or medical care, and there's a consensus like we want to get to the bottom of this. We want to find the right answer. But in these areas, there's a hesitancy to even approach them. So I think it's very important for us in these explorations that we're courageous in seeking the right answers to the questions because they have such serious implications for the good of society. Um, I also think it's worth mentioning too, Frank, that we struggle so much today with the reality that ideologies do compete more so than in past decades, and certain ideologies in particular are pursuing dominance. And so, while a live and let live balance is attractive and maybe even the ideal, what's actually playing out is that secular ideologies are not leaving room for any other perspective. So I think of the example of the Jack Phillips case where the prevailing government power doesn't even want to tolerate the idea that somewhere someone in Colorado is making a cake and he's Christian and he has a biblical view of marriage. It's like he has to be stopped. Or I think of like the Fulton versus City of Philadelphia case. It's, everyone who wants to participate in foster care was able to do so, and yet the city went on the offensive targeting the church merely because it existed and it disagreed with the city's preferred view on this critical issue of marriage.
Yeah, no, these are great segues to the other point that we wanted to make about secular laws and how they conflict with religion, right? The Cake Baker case, poor Jack Phillips has been in court for over a decade now, right? And then the Fulton case with the foster care system in Philadelphia. These highlight a really big issue that, in theory, proponents of a secular worldview and a secular view of government would say, this is about keeping religion from imposing its views on all of society, and will bracket that and say that's not what's going on here, right? These policy issues are usually not a matter of tolerance of multiple viewpoints, but they're actually a matter of coercion, imposing a non-religious mandate on all practitioners in a certain field, right? So we'll explain, but I think again, the Cake Baker and Fulton are great examples of this. And these kind of coercive laws are a big problem for the free exercise of religion. If law and policy are used not only to create space for certain ideas, even if they're bad ideas, right? That's one thing. But when laws go beyond making space for a diversity of viewpoints and ways of practicing in a certain field, and actually move to make the certain secular view normative and required, religious exercise is pretty clearly in danger, right? Because what these laws are often saying is, no, there's this non-religious way that we're going to do X, right? You may not bake a cake unless you're going to adhere to these secular values, or you're not able to be a foster parent unless you're going to adhere to all these secular values. This is coercion, and this is boxing religious believers out of important parts of society. So, just to lay out a couple of the common examples that'll probably come up in legal cases that we'll talk about in the coming weeks and months, right? It's one thing for the government to allow people to claim that they're a gender other than their God-given sex. It's quite another thing, though, to require people to lie, to use pronouns, or to affirm medical procedures as good, even though they don't accord with the truth of the human person, human sexuality, and how a person was made, right? So again, you move very quickly from tolerance of different ideas to coercion. Again, it's one thing for government to falsely acknowledge that a same-sex relationship is a marriage, again, permissive. But it's quite another thing to require employers and providers of public programming to acknowledge and provide support for these behaviors, to apply benefits equally to these people as married couples, to force an acknowledgement that this is a good thing. Again, we've moved beyond tolerance, letting these people engage in these behaviors, to coercion, requiring religious believers to affirm and sometimes spend money to back these practices up. And one more example, probably another common one. It's one thing, I think a horrible thing, for the government to allow the killing of unborn children in their mother's womb via abortion. But again, that's the permissive. It's quite another thing when the law steps in and requires religious employers to provide healthcare plans, for example, that pay for abortions, or to forbid religious individuals and organizations from discouraging abortion, from protesting abortion, for providing pro-life pregnancy centers that provide alternatives to abortion. I know I'm repeating myself, but I'm doing it for a reason. These are not matters of law used to create diversity and tolerance. These are laws meant to coerce and block religious viewpoints out of a lot of important areas of public life.
Yes, it's so true, and I think it's really well put, Frank. You're kind of summarizing, I think, one of the biggest challenges of our age, which is that areas that were traditionally the province of religion, these beliefs about the human person, such as the sanctity of life or marriage, these are not new beliefs. They've been held for millennia, and yet they've become areas in which the government wants to plant a flag and is now taking aggressive and opposing positions against these views. Um, it's not just the government sort of saying this is our preferred policy or this is the stance of our administration, but rather we're actually going to go out and enforce and impose and crowd out any individual or organization with a contrary viewpoint. And that's just so dangerous. I think we've talked a lot, Frank, about the Little Sisters of the Poor. This order where they're serving the elderly who are experiencing poverty. It's this beautiful mission, so rooted in the dignity of the human person. They have been doing this for decades, and then all of a sudden, the government takes this position that contradicts the order's beliefs on human life. They're asking the order to participate in this contraceptive mandate, and the order has been just doing its work for all these decades. Suddenly, the administration says, "No, it's not enough for us to believe this. You have to believe and participate as well." And these are these are illustrative anecdotes, but it's this macro trend that's so pronounced today.
Yeah. No, the Little Sisters of the Poor is such a poignant and powerful example of what we're talking about. And I think this leads to an important distinction in what we mean by religious freedom, because I think there's been a trend for many decades. You can probably pinpoint like the 1940s and the when all of a sudden Thomas Jefferson's Danbury Baptist letter with the wall of separation between church and state became not just a private letter, but legal precedent. But I think probably since then, there's been this movement to kind of cabin religious freedom as the freedom to worship and to privately believe what you want. Um, and that's obviously not the view of religious freedom that we advocate for, nor I would say is that the view of religious freedom that was part of the founding of this country. It was much broader. So the way we articulate it, and I think the correct way, is that religious freedom means the freedom to live and to work publicly in accordance with religious principles, because it's beneficial to society and it's for the promotion of the common good. So when law and policy are guided by secular values that are hostile to religious faith, when the law is used to accomplish things contrary to the good of society and contrary to religion, religious freedom does mean the freedom for people and organizations to speak up, to act, to work, to live from a religious viewpoint. It doesn't just mean they can go to church on Sundays and they can believe these things privately. It means they can actually bring those beliefs into the public square and they're part of the conversation. Um, so this religious viewpoint, again, it might not always involve obviously religious content. And I think that's really important for us to articulate, right? The free exercise of religion will sometimes mean defending a religious understanding of the human person, of sex and sexuality, of marriage, even if the speech doesn't explicitly seem religious, right? For somebody to be able to speak about the truth about man and woman and marriage, they might not be quoting the Bible, they might not be explicitly referencing God, but that doesn't mean that it's not a religious expression. So again, as we cover a lot of law and policy issues, I think they're not always going to be apparent that, oh, this is a religious issue. This looks like a free speech issue or a freedom of association issue, but it very much touches on the ability to exercise religion in the public square.
Yes, it's amazing to think that when we talk about religious freedom, at a certain point, or in some sense, we're just talking about the freedom for a person with religious faith to exist and have a voice in the public square. It's which seems so fundamental. And it's particularly worth drawing attention to and navigating when a religious freedom, like you said, Frank, is coming not as a religious freedom question per se, but a question of human anthropology and related public policy that have deep religious significance, and some might even argue are fundamentally religious questions. Um, I think we also want to note that these areas, these questions, they can be discussed and defended from many perspectives. So, for society as a whole, truth claims about human anthropology they can be explored from so many ways, and there's outstanding scholarship on these issues. I think Dr. Ryan Anderson has written very well on this. Carl Truman is another great author on these issues. For us at Napa Legal, because we're approaching and focusing on these issues from the perspective of faith-based nonprofits, um, we will be discussing them as religious liberty issues because that's how we encounter those issues. In other words, with our mission being to make space for the flourishing of faith-based nonprofits, questions of human anthropology come to the surface as religious liberty questions because a policy that doesn't allow an organization to espouse, for example, a biblical view of marriage or human life, is a policy that doesn't allow these organizations to exist at all.
Yeah, that's a great point to kind of tie up this whole conversation and show how high the stakes are here, right? If you're saying, okay, in theory, religious organizations are allowed to exist. You can be a Catholic school, you can be a Christian pregnancy center, but you're not allowed to express anything that deviates from the kind of secular line about same-sex relationships, about transgender issues, about abortion, any of these things. You're right, this doesn't allow religious organizations to be religious organizations. You're basically saying, oh, you can slap the label Catholic on your
Yeah.
school, but you can't articulate a Catholic vision of the world. And that's not acceptable shouldn't be acceptable, as you said earlier, to anyone who cares about freedom in general, let alone religious freedom and religious issues. So to just kind of tie this together, some of the issues we discuss at Napa Legal, particularly on this podcast, they might not obviously seem to be religious freedom issues in the sense that they're not strictly about allowing religious individuals or organizations to practice their religion. But standing up for the truth about the human person, human sexuality, and so on is very much a religious freedom issue. All right, promoting the work of religion is intimately tied to these law and policy issues surrounding human dignity and sexuality and marriage. And so, if laws and policies continue to be enacted at the state level, at the federal level, that coerce religious believers into accepting certain things, speaking certain ways, living certain ways that are contrary to the truth of the human person, the truth of human sexuality, ultimately contrary to the truth of these religions, uh, this is a direct religious freedom issue. So I know that I'm repeating myself, but that's the one thing that we want to make very clear as we move forward and start to discuss law and policy issues in future episodes, that this is very much within the scope of the religious liberty work that we care about at Napa Legal.
Yes, thank you, Frank. I think you're completely right. It's such an important and it's too often misunderstood, this tension. So I'm so glad we've been able to set forward these principles as our foundation, and we look forward to discussing current events through the lens of religious freedom. The general flow of our podcast moving forward will be for our team to discuss legal issues, whether court cases, legislation, other questions that affect religious liberty and the work of faith based nonprofits. This first episode is quite different. It's a bit more philosophical, more focused on first principles than the case specific conversations we'll have in the coming weeks. But we think this introductory episode was very important to set the stage because we want our listeners and our supporters to understand where we're coming from and why we believe legal issues are relevant to religious liberty when there isn't an express connection.
Yeah, that's a great distinction between this episode and future episodes. So I would just kind of highlight, if you come to this podcast looking for on the ground, I want the litigation and the pending statutes at the state level that are most relevant to religious liberty. Don't worry, we're not going to be as philosophical and explicit about first principles in every episode. But if, on the other hand, you really like the kind of high level philosophical first principle discussions, don't worry. I'm sure it will keep coming up in future episodes as we're discussing particular legal and policy cases. So I think we'll mix the best of both worlds moving forward. So with that, thank you for joining us for the first episode of the Napa Legal Podcast. We hope you'll join us next week as we begin to dive into some of the most important ongoing legal issues that affect religious liberty and the work of faith-based nonprofit organizations.
We'll talk to you next week. Thank you again for joining us, and God bless you all.